do your research first and then work out whether or not that pay at time and a half really is something you want to be involved in if you're going to be depriving citizens of some basic human rights.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to another episode of the New South Wales One Nation TV. Today, I have a very special guest with me. I don't like to have favorites, but I do. And I must admit that today's guest is one of my favorites because one, I'm incredibly proud of the man that he is, and two, I'm biased because of my background. And without further ado, I'd love to welcome Roland, who was a former New South Wales police officer. Thank you, Roland.
Thanks very much, Evelyn. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, I wanted to have you on because obviously you have made a huge decision for your life when it comes to your livelihood and your career. So I would love for you to explain to the people who might be watching this just a bit of your background, where you've come from, and I guess the big question, why you decided to leave the New South Wales Police Force.
Yeah, sure. So, look, I spent a little over 3 decades in uniform street-level policing around the Sydney metro area mainly, from the north down into the southwest and out west and so on. For the vast majority of that service, it was very good. But once the requirements started to flow in for police to enforce these draconian public health orders, I could see the job that I had done for the previous 30 years was coming to an end. And I flatly refused to engage in any of that enforcement on very valid grounds as far as I was concerned, because when you read our Code of Conduct and Ethics and our Statement of Values, it's very clear as to what's expected of us corporately and from a legislative point of view. And I didn't see how I could comply with both. And the higher requirement was to comply with the legislation. That's Section 7 of the Police Act of 1990. That's where we derive our Statement of Values. So if I was going to stay true to that Statement of Values and act with ethics and uphold freedoms and uphold the rule of law, I couldn't go out and enforce these draconian public health orders. So come late July, I walked out, actually through stress. And after a couple of months of going through the rigmarole of discussing legal issues and so on, I tendered my resignation. And that was prior to the mandate for police to be vaccinated. But look, I stepped out because as a serving police officer, you can't speak your mind without the authorisation of the department. And so if I was going to have any say for the police who are left in there and for the public, then I had to leave that role of a police officer to actually be able to uphold the rule and the role of a police officer. So it's quite ironic.
Wow, that's a huge decision that you made. And again, as I said, like one that I feel you should be really proud of. And at the moment, I guess this will lead into my next sort of question. We're seeing like a real decay in the relationship between law enforcement and civilian. And it's been heartbreaking to watch. I mean, you only have to go on mainstream media and social media, independent media, to see all the videos that are kind of rolling in with the enforcement of these public health orders, not just in New South Wales, but in lots of different states around the country. And, you know, what's gone from a really positive relationship with public and police has now turned very negative. You know, I mentioned to you previously that growing up, you would see cops are tops stickers on the back of cars. You know, you'd go to the Sydney Royal Easter Show, you'd get a New South Wales Police show bag, and you'd go home and you'd see everything and you say, I want to be a cop when I'm older, mum and dad. And sadly, I think that's going to not be a thing if things, you know, continue down the path that it is. And just from your perspective, you did work through a little bit of the pandemic and, you know, you've come out of it now, but how have you seen the relationship with police and law enforcement? And have you seen the gradual decay in that relationship? And what do you think that's going to mean moving forward for the police and civilian?
Yeah, look, I've definitely seen that, the destruction of that relationship, and it hasn't been gradual, it's been rapid. There are people who will look upon the police when they recognise police, generally marked vehicles and in uniform. And there's obviously a mix of the expressions that you get from people. Um, but predominantly, most of the public appreciate the police, and they and the view from the police vehicle window, unless unless someone is actively committing an offence, it's usually fairly positive.
Mm.
I saw that change. It became quite apparent that upon the arrival of police on scene, there was an air of discomfort and unease amongst the public. So I noticed a very rapid decline in that relationship.
Yeah, and that's really sad because you would know, and I would know from experience, that our biggest asset is a good relationship with the community, not just to keep the community safe, but to keep ourselves safe and our offsiders safe. And, I think that with the fracture of relationship between law enforcement and civilian, we're going to see crime increase. We're going to see less cooperation, a lot of mistrust. And it's quite sad. But during the pandemic, if you're able to, I would love to hear your thoughts on things that you identified with the enforcement of these orders that you saw as a real problem, and I guess how you felt things could have been handled a lot better from a policing perspective.
Sure. Well, look, I was always trained, as I believe most officers still are trained, that when there is a dispute between federal and state legislation, then federal overrides state. And so the training that I received prior to walking out, so as of late July, did not really discuss the Biosecurity Act of 2015, which is the federal legislation to deal with any pandemic, be it real or imagined. Now, that legislation, the Biosecurity Act, has many safeguards built into it. You can't just make an order across an LGA or across a whole city. You can't deprive people of their basic human rights just on the say-so of one bureaucrat. And so where our statement of values requires us to uphold the rule of law and to act with integrity, we are governed, in my view, by the Biosecurity Act. To go out and enforce public health orders that ignore or put aside all of these safeguards, and that is a lower form of rule or order in the hierarchy of legislation. To only enforce that lower end of rules and ignore the federal legislation lacks integrity. And as I say, we are duty bound. People can go and look up Section 7 of the Police Act of 1990, or just look up New South Wales Police Force Statement of Values. Go and research it right now. Read through that list of 7 or 8 points, and it tells everyone that legislation underpins the conduct of every officer, and be that sworn or unsworn. So even our civilian staff, who are just as affected. And so if we are told that we're duty bound to comply with that legislation, but then we completely ignore it, then there's an issue there.
And I think I've mentioned to you on other occasions before, the training in the police, like we're not really educated well enough on our system of law, on our separation of powers between federal and state. And that's something that probably should be rectified, especially moving forward if this pandemic continues to roll on and things need to be enforced. But, in your opinion, would you say that police are enjoying enforcing these? Like, what is the feel from other officers that you've worked with or you've spoken to? Is this something that they're enjoying doing? Can they see, I guess, the problems of enforcing these things? How would you describe that sort of dynamic?
Well, look, the police force is like any representation of society. Once people become police officers, they don't suddenly take on a new persona and forget everything. They are a portion of what you're in high school with. We like to think that they're better selection of that high school class, and I do believe that they are. But they're still subject to many of the same issues. So, for instance, you have officers who will gladly go and partake in the hotel quarantines for a long time. I don't know if it's still the case. They're getting paid time and a half. So for them, a little gold mine, to go and participate in the removal of basic human rights based on what? On a state of emergency? What emergency? Do your research first and then work out whether or not that pay at time and a half really is something you want to be involved in if you're going to be depriving citizens of some basic human rights. The police are definitely a difficult group to put into one box. I mean, you have officers who have spent their careers, however long or short they are, where they have been given directives and orders and they've never really had to stop and question them. And as I've said before, you can only really have a paramilitary organisation function properly when officers don't stop and question every order they're given, because we'll be managing ourselves to a standstill in that case. But we're in a new paradigm now. This is the one time in the last 30 years that I can see of any significance where officers do actually need to stop and take a long, hard look at what they're being asked to do and the legality of it, the appropriateness of it.
Were you able to have conversations with colleagues when you were still serving and I guess after you were about these sorts of things? Were you able to sort of stir up the hard questions and get a response for them? Or is it just something that you didn't really and you weren't able to have a conversation with?
Yeah, I did. I started to discuss these issues on a broader scale even a couple of years ago because I could see, I didn't know what the mechanism was, but I could see that basically our human rights were being incrementally removed from us. Anyone who thinks that this situation we're in is the result of a bat swimming in soup in China and someone nibbling on some bat wings, I think they're kind of missing the point. This is a decades long situation that's coming to fruition now. And so yeah, I did have discussions. I asked some of my colleagues what the line in the sand would be for them. Would they be prepared at some stage to kick indoors on the pretense of a health crisis? A lot of them looked at me like I had two heads. They just couldn't foresee that sort of thing would happen. And hopefully it never will. But, the legislation is there in many states for that kind of thing to go ahead. And I mean, the legislation is there also in the Biosecurity Act, but it has safeguards. Very good safeguards where people suspected on reasonable grounds of being infected with a known human disease must be issued an individual order. And then they can challenge the validity of that before a court. So we don't have any of those safeguards now. So I did try to have that discussion, but, talking to one or two colleagues or three or four colleagues, it's going to have very minimal effect. And that was very much part of the reason why I stepped away from the department, so that I would not be governed by a social media policy that will prevent me from speaking.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you did, because I feel like it's people like yourself who are going to be needed more than ever moving forward out of this. And if we are to, I guess, repair the fracture in our relationship with law enforcement, it's people like yourself who need to shed light. And you have such a unique perspective being on both sides of it. So I'm grateful. I'm sad that we lost someone like yourself on the street, because you are exactly what we need. You're the caliber of police officer. You want enforcing the law. I'm sad that, we lost you, but I'm also grateful that you might be able to help current serving police officers more in the position that you're in today than you'd be able to help if you were still serving. But I guess my next question, I wanted to touch on the mandates. You mentioned that the mandates hit the New South Wales Police Force and that you were able to, you resigned prior to that, but can you explain to me the process of that and when it was mandated for the police? And finally, if there are many police who are opposing it and who are losing their jobs because of it?
Yeah, sure. Look, it'll have to be off the top of my head. I left in late July, as I say, on stress leave. I resigned. I think it was put in my resignation the end of September. To my recollection, officers who wanted to remain on duty had to have their first jab. I think it was by the end of October, and maybe their second jab by the end of November. Now, we were always told, and I stand to be corrected on those dates, but we were always told that it would not be mandatory. And our police association told us that they would not support a mandate. But of course, both of those situations changed dramatically. And like most of the unions, there was no real support offered. And then the mandate came in. There were some officers who did accept the offer of the vaccine before the mandate. And that was on the assumption on their part that due diligence had been done by the department. And there was just another step of being a police officer. But none of them, in my view, would have had informed consent, because I've not found anyone in the community who has informed consent, because it's just not, both sides of the information are not on offer. You know, the censorship of any negativity towards the jab is so harsh that how can you possibly develop informed consent? And then you have many officers who were not keen on it, but because of the mandate, they have been coerced against our federal guidelines and against every international treaty. They've been coerced under the threat of loss of employment and even disciplinary action for non-compliance. So they've gone ahead and accepted the offer of the jab. They had a small group left who declined the offer, and they have tried to mount legal action through Industrial Relations Commission and through the courts. And it seems like every I has been dotted and every T has been crossed. To make it extremely difficult for anyone to challenge this. But we're seeing this right across the planet. You know, it seems to be the same program rolled out, be it New York Fire Department, be it LAPD cops, be it the nurses here in New South Wales, be it the teachers, be it anybody. Everyone's running to a very similar and very harsh script. And so where we're at now with the New South Wales officers, it's been a very, very difficult couple of weeks. We've had the senior commanders of each person's chain of command come out to their house and issue them what's called a show cause notice. And that's a notice that tells them that the commissioners basically lost confidence, that he's found them to be of poor integrity. And I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the document in front of me, so don't quote me, but basically calling these officers or these civilian staff members' integrity into question and saying that you have 3 weeks to respond, but we're basically going to be dismissing you from misconduct. And, you know, it quotes the Code of Conduct and Ethics, it quotes the Statement of Values, and tells that individual staff member or officer just how badly they're behaving by declining the offer of this exploratory voluntary drug. And that's regardless of whether they've got 5 or 10 or 20 years service and good service. All that's put aside, and they're basically told that they're worth nothing and they'll be dismissed under misconduct. So it's a terrible situation, and I know a lot of industries online are going through this. It's a little bit more of a pointed, sharp-ended thing for police officers because you know, the good cops who have, and the good cops are the majority of cops, but the good cops who have, for want of a better term, held the line and who have sought bodily autonomy, regardless of how hard they've worked for the community, the commissioner somehow has lost confidence in them and is going to dismiss them. Well, I long ago lost confidence in you, Commissioner Fuller, how you can treat your staff in this way is just absolutely disgusting. So a loss of confidence goes both ways.
Yeah, that's really sad. And I understand being dismissed like that changes the way that you obviously leave your employment, like being basically kicked out and fired from and having your badge stripped from you is very different to making an informed decision and resigning on your own terms. So yeah, very sad. Are there many police in that position? Are you aware of?
Unfortunately not. When I say unfortunately, it's unfortunate that more didn't take a stand and more didn't understand the broader concerns here. So those concerns are not only the health aspects, but it's also the incremental loss of basic rights. So if police officers did not recognise the line in the sand that was being crossed with the government basically mandating an assault upon you with an exploratory drug, if somehow so many cops have missed that, what's the next line in the sand?
Mm.
So now they're coming after kids with something that we're all told kids are not carriers, they're not affected by COVID. There'll be no mandate for kids. Well, here we go. Mandating it for kids or pushing towards that. And we're seeing it around the planet in the same way. So what we're seeing in one country will go planetary. What we're seeing in another country, it's all the same script, and we're just seeing different parts of that script played out in different nations. But if cops can't see the line in the sand, it has to be our children. You know, I mean, I'm personally hearing stories. Personally, people are contacting me and saying, man, this is actually difficult to verbalise, but it has to be said. The number of babies that are turning up in mortuaries is staggering. And so for me to remain a police officer, here's the ironic thing. For me to remain a police officer and uphold the rule of law and protect civilians was almost impossible because I was not compliant with the narrative. And there's been times over my career of 30 years where I have attempted to rectify problems, report misconduct, and there's plenty of policies in there, internal grievance policies. And you're legally obliged, and we're told time and time again, you're legally obliged to report misconduct. But I'll tell you what, the instances where I've tried to report that, it hasn't gone well. It has not gone well, and it's left me with a very bitter taste in my mouth as to the hierarchy of the New South Wales Police over those years, when I've tried to do the right thing, and it's come back very hard, very forcefully against me. And so to stay in the police force and to try and bring to light the concerns that I have, it was going to be pointless. So that's why it has to be a grassroots solution. It has to come externally and come back to each individual officer as a message upon them, how they read their oath of office, how they understand their statement of values and their code of conduct, and how it impacts on them personally. Because departmentally, it's useless.
Yes, I understand that better than most. I fully understand. It's a really hard beast to tackle, especially from the inside. So as I said, I'm grateful that you're here, that you're in it. And I'd love to finish off by asking you, where can people follow you? Where can people support you? And how can people get in touch with you, whether that's police who are serving, who need support, whether that's, the public who are just looking to sort of bridge that gap again? Where can we reach you, Roland?
Sure. Look, there's several ways. For now, I'm still on Facebook. I don't know how long I'll stay on there. I'm getting the usual censorship notifications that I'm posting stuff that's apparently spam and against their guidelines or whatever their guidelines are. But I'm on Facebook as Roland Chrystal, and that's CHRYSTAL, former police officer. That's a page that I have. People can also find us on Telegram under Cops for COVID Truth, and just by looking up the website Cops for COVID Truth, We're currently developing that website and building it. We're going to have more former officers come and join us. So we'll have a panel of officers who are coming out to speak from various states. And then we've also got policeforfreedom.org. Now, Police for Freedom is an international organisation that was developed in Spain as a response to the problems between police and the society, and to try and bridge that gap and maintain a beneficial relationship. So it's fairly new in New South Wales. We've only just really begun it, but we will be endeavouring to grow that with our Cops Code of Truth website. So they'll be running together, but policeforfreedom.org is certainly worth having a look at as well.
Amazing. Thank you again so much for coming today. I wish I could talk to you for longer about so many issues relating to the police, but we'll save that for another day. And yeah, again, thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. And I look forward to seeing you guys again for the next episode with a new guest. But again, thanks Roland for joining me.
Thank you. Much appreciated.